The scent of salt air in the Pacific Northwest doesn't smell like freedom. Not to me. It smells like wet cedar, expensive engine exhaust, and the cold, metallic tang of a life I was allowed to watch but never touch. My name is Leo. I am 32 years old, and if you saw me standing on the rugged cliffs of Whidbey Island today, you'd see a man who looks like he belongs to the landscape, sharp, weathered, and immovable. But for 3 decades, I was a ghost in my own hallways. I was the static on the radio, the shadow cast by a sun that only shone on one person, my older brother, Julian. In our family, there was a biological law we called the hierarchy of breath. It wasn't written down, but it was enforced with the precision of a court order. Julian was the air. He was the lungs of the household. When he breathed, my parents, Silas and Elena, expanded. When he struggled, they suffocated. And me? I was the vacuum. I was expected to exist in the spaces where Julian wasn't. I was the silent observer of a masterpiece I wasn't allowed to paint. Julian was born under a lucky star that never seemed to set. He was the golden child, a title he wore with a terrifying, effortless grace. If Julian caught a cold, the house became a sanitarium, organic broths were simmered, specialists were called, and the world stopped turning until his temperature hit 98.6. But the favoritism wasn't just about health, it was about the very soul of the family. Julian was the investment. I was the overhead. I remember the way my father looked at him, a gaze full of reflected glory, as if Julian's existence justified Silas's own failures. They didn't just love him, they worshipped the idea of him. And as I stood in the periphery, I learned the most dangerous lesson a child can acquire, that love isn't a right. It's a currency. And in the bank of Silas and Elena, my account was permanently overdrawn. I grew up understanding that my role was to be the foil to Julian's brilliance. If he was the star, I was the darkness that made him look brighter. I was the other son. The one who was fine. The one who didn't need anything. It's a special kind of trauma, being told you're strong simply because no one wants to bother helping you. The disparity was a slow-acting poison. It wasn't one big blow. It was 1,000 microscopic cuts. It was the way the conversation shifted when I entered a room, moving from Julian's soaring achievements back to the weather. It was the way my birthdays were family dinners, while Julian's were events. You don't realize you're being erased while it's happening. You just wake up one day and realize you've become transparent. You start to wonder if, should you stop speaking entirely, anyone would even notice the silence. Spoiler alert, they wouldn't. Julian didn't just get the gold of our family's resources, he got the grace for every sin he ever committed. And as I watched him glide through life on a carpet of parental sacrifice, I began to realize that if I wanted to survive, I had to learn how to breathe underwater. Because in this house, there wasn't enough air for the both of us. I was 9 years old when the lesson of my worth was finally etched into my bones. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray, drizzling afternoon that defines the coast. There was an old Douglas fir at the edge of our property, its branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Julian had dared me to climb it. He stood at the bottom, his hands in his pockets, a smirk playing on his face, the look of a boy who knew he would never have to take the risks he demanded of others. I climbed. I wanted that look of approval, that rare moment where Julian might see me as an equal. I reached for a branch that looked solid but was hollow with rot. The snap sounded like a pistol shot. The world tilted, a kaleidoscope of green needles and gray sky, and then the ground rushed up to meet me. I hit a protruding root with my left arm. The pain was immediate and transformative. It wasn't a dull ache, it was a white-hot scream that traveled from my wrist to my skull. I looked down and saw the unnatural angle of my forearm, the bone threatening to puncture the skin. I didn't cry out for a long time. I just sat there, cradling the wreckage of my arm, gasping. When Julian finally walked over, he didn't reach out. He didn't ask if I was okay. He looked at my arm with a squint of mild annoyance, as if my injury was a stain on his afternoon. "You're so clumsy, Leo," he muttered. "Mom's going to be pissed." He was right. When I stumbled into the kitchen, clutching my arm, blood draining from my face, Elena didn't rush to me. She didn't drop the towel she was holding. She looked at me, then at the floor, making sure I wasn't dripping mud on her tiles. Her first words weren't, "Are you hurt?" They were, "Do you have any idea how much a cast costs?" The drive to the emergency room was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. My father, Silas, sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't talk to me. He talked at the windshield. He gave me a lecture on responsibility and the burden of carelessness. He spoke about the high deductible on their insurance plan as if I had intentionally broken my arm to spite their savings account. I sat in the back seat, my arm throbbing in time with the windshield wipers, listening to the cost of my existence being calculated in real time. Julian never would have been so reckless, Elena sighed from the passenger seat. He knows the value of things. You, Leo, you act like money grows on that very tree you fell out of. That was the theme of my childhood. My pain was an inconvenience, Julian's whims were a priority. While my broken bone was treated like a financial betrayal, Julian's tuition for a private academy was framed as a necessary investment in the family legacy. They sold a collection of heirloom silver, pieces that were supposed to be passed down to both of us, just to cover his first semester fees. I sat at the dinner table with my heavy plaster cast, watching them toast to Julian's bright future. No one mentioned the silver. No one mentioned the arm. I was the overhead cost of Julian's glory. I learned then that the only way to avoid being shamed for the cost of my life was to stop costing them anything at all. I stopped asking for new clothes. I stopped asking for help with school. I became a master of the quiet fix. When my shoes wore through, I stuffed them with cardboard. When I needed a calculator for math, I worked an extra shift mucking out stalls at a neighbor's farm to buy it myself. I wasn't being responsible, as Silas liked to claim later, I was being a refugee. I was learning that in the American noir of my family life, the hero doesn't get saved. The hero just learns how to bleed in silence so he doesn't ruin the rug. By the time I turned 18, the mask of the perfect family had completely slipped, at least for me. Julian had moved on to a prestigious university, a transition eased by my parents paying his rent on a sprawling loft in the city and sending him emergency wire transfers that fueled a lifestyle of craft cocktails and designer denim. He was finding himself, a luxury that apparently required $10,000 a month and a complete lack of accountability. Meanwhile, I was living in a different reality. I stayed behind, enrolled in a local community college, and took a graveyard shift at a roadside diner called the Rusty Anchor. It was a place where the air was thick with the smell of old grease and the desperate hopes of truckers passing through at 3 in the morning. I'd spend 8 hours on my feet, pouring coffee for men with haunted eyes, then head straight to a 9 o'clock microeconomics class, my skin smelling of fried onions and floor cleaner. I remember one specific night. It was raining, one of those torrential downpours that felt like the sky was trying to scrub the island out of existence. I was scrubbing a griddle, my hands red and raw from the chemicals, when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from a social media app. Julian had posted a photo. He was in the French Alps, a trip my parents had dubbed a cultural necessity after he complained about the stress of his junior year. In the photo, Julian was glowing, a glass of expensive wine in one hand, the snow-capped peaks behind him. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to lose yourself to find yourself." I looked at my reflection in the stainless steel of the industrial fridge. I was 20, but I looked 35. There were dark circles under my eyes that no amount of sleep would ever fix. I hadn't found myself because I hadn't been allowed to get lost. I was too busy making sure I didn't drown. I had asked Silas for a $300 loan 2 weeks prior to cover a textbook and a repair for my beat-up car. He had told me, without looking up from his newspaper, that hardship builds character, Leo. You'll thank me one day for not spoiling you. That was the moment the ghost was born. I realized that as long as I was Leo, I was a target for their lessons and a footstool for their pride. I needed to become something else. I began to use the quiet they had forced upon me. I started staying late at the college computer lab. I taught myself how to code, not just for fun, but as a way to build a door out of the room they had locked me in. I began to live a double life. During the day, I was the struggling son, the one who drove the rusting sedan and worked the diner shifts. But at night, in the blue light of a flickering monitor, I was building a digital fortress. I started a small cybersecurity firm from a windowless basement apartment that smelled of damp earth. I called it Aegis. I chose the name because an Aegis is a shield, and I was tired of being hit. I worked with a cold, clinical fury. Every time Julian posted a photo of a new car or a beach in Bali, I wrote another 1,000 lines of code. Every time Elena called to tell me how proud she was of Julian's latest consulting venture, which was really just Silas funding a shell company. I secured another client. I didn't tell them. Not a word. I knew how the predators in my house operated. If they knew I had a feast, they'd demand a seat at the table. If they knew I had built a ladder, they'd saw off the rungs to keep me from climbing higher than Julian. I scaled quietly. I moved from small local businesses to regional contracts. I stayed in the shadows, a digital ghost, watching my bank account grow while I continued to wear the same 3 flannel shirts to family dinners. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to see if there was any limit to their blindness. And as I sat in that basement, watching the lines of code scroll by like a falling green rain, I realized I had hit something real. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. And the best part? They had no idea that the careless son was currently sitting on the most valuable secret in the family. But as I finalized the paperwork for a merger that would change my life forever, I noticed a strange recurring glitch in my personal servers, a series of pings coming from an IP address that felt uncomfortably close to home. The pings on my server weren't a random anomaly. They were rhythmic, persistent, like a heartbeat from a ghost. I spent 3 nights tracking the source, my eyes burning in the blue glare of the monitor, only to find the trail led back to a residential gateway in a neighborhood I knew by heart. My parents' house. They weren't looking for me, they didn't care enough to look, but they were looking for Aegis. They were looking for the shield I had built to protect myself, likely prompted by some headline about a rising local tech firm. They were hunting for a piece of the future, never realizing the man behind the curtain was the son they had relegated to the basement. I didn't shut the door. I just made it invisible. I moved my operations to a high-security server farm in the city and went back to work. I had to be perfect. I had to be silent. Because in the world of high-impact storytelling, the hero doesn't reveal the weapon until the villain is already in the trap. I poured every ounce of that banked resentment into the architecture of my software. It was more than a business, it was an exorcism. I was coding a version of myself that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be broken, and couldn't be shamed for the cost of its existence. While Julian was blowing through a $60,000 business loan from Silas to launch a luxury lifestyle blog that had no readers, I was quietly securing government-grade logistics contracts. I lived on coffee and the cold adrenaline of a man who knows the tides are turning. I stayed in that basement until the damp felt like a second skin, watching my revenue numbers climb into the millions. It was a surreal, bifurcated life. One morning, I was scrubbing the underside of a grease trap at the diner. That afternoon, I was on a conference call with a private equity firm in Manhattan. I'd changed my shirt in the car, moving from the smell of old fry oil to the sterile scent of a new laptop, a shapeshifter in a world that only saw what it wanted to see. The scale of what I was building began to terrify me. It was no longer a side hustle or a way out, it was a monster. I had developed a proprietary encryption method for logistics tracking that made the industry standard look like a child's toy. People weren't just interested, they were desperate. I was 28 when the first serious offer hit my inbox. Then the second. By 30, I was a name spoken in hushed tones in the valley, the ghost of Whidbey. I kept the nickname. It suited me. I had been a ghost my entire life, it was only fair I started haunting the market. I refined the noir aesthetic of my life, keeping my footprint small, my car modest, and my mouth shut. I still went to the occasional family Sunday brunch, sitting there in my faded jeans, listening to Julian explain why his influencer retreat in Tulum was actually a tax-deductible market research expense. Silas would nod, his eyes full of that misplaced pride, while Elena would ask me if I was still doing that computer stuff. I'd just smile and say it paid the bills. I was the vacuum, remember? And I was currently sucking all the air out of their future without them even knowing it. The climax of the quiet years happened on a Tuesday in November. I was sitting in a glass-walled office in downtown Seattle, far above the fog and the rain, staring at a single piece of paper. It was the final acquisition offer from a global logistics conglomerate. The number at the bottom was $30 million. Cash. No earnouts, no lingering ties, just a clean break. I sat there for an hour, the silence of the room pressing against my ears. I thought about the broken arm. I thought about the silver heirlooms sold for Julian's tuition. I thought about the night I slept in my car because I couldn't afford the gas to drive back to a home that didn't want me. I signed the paper. The ink felt like fire. I didn't go out for champagne. I didn't call a friend. I walked out of the building, went to a local park, and sat on a bench in the cold drizzle until my bones ached. I wanted to feel the transition. I wanted to know what it felt like to be a man who owned the air. The money hit my account 48 hours later. I refreshed the screen and watched the zeros line up like soldiers. It was a strange, hollow victory. For 10 years, I had been fueled by the need to prove them wrong, but now that the proof was sitting in a high-yield savings account, the target had vanished. I was a ghost who had suddenly inherited the cemetery. I spent the next few months in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I bought a minimalist office, hired a lawyer who looked like she chewed nails for breakfast, and began the process of hard-coding my life. I wasn't just protecting my money, I was protecting my peace. I set up trusts, shell companies, and layers of legal armor that made my wealth a fortress. I was done being the boy who fell out of the tree. I was the tree now. And the roots went deeper than any of them could imagine. But the silence was starting to itch. I found myself looking at the calendar, watching the days crawl toward December. Every year, Silas and Elena hosted a founders' gala at the Island Estate, a self-indulgent party where they parade Julian in front of their aging friends and celebrate a family legacy built on a foundation of favoritism and debt. I hadn't gone in years. I was usually too busy or not dressed for the occasion. But this year, a heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived at my small apartment. It was addressed to Leo in Elena's perfect, practiced script. Inside was an invitation to the gala, but there was a handwritten note at the bottom: Julian is announcing his big venture. It would be nice if you could show some support for once. Dress is formal. Try to look presentable. I stared at the note until the words blurred. Show some support. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. They wanted me there to be the shadow again, the dull background to Julian's latest neon-lit failure. They wanted the vacuum to return so the air would feel more abundant for the golden child. I looked at the invite, then at the bank statement on my second monitor, then at the file my lawyer had sent me, the one detailing the precarious state of Silas's actual finances. The family estate wasn't a legacy, it was a sinking ship held together by high-interest loans and denial. They were inviting me to a celebration of a lie. I decided then that I would go. But I wouldn't go as the son who needed a $300 loan. I wouldn't go as the boy with the broken arm. I would go as the ghost. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I didn't buy a flashy car, that would be too easy, too Julian. Instead, I spent a small fortune on a suit that looked like a shadow. Charcoal wool, tailored so perfectly it felt like a second skin, a watch that cost more than my father's car but looked like a simple piece of steel to the untrained eye. I was crafting a presence that was quiet, expensive, and utterly terrifying. I wanted to be the most powerful person in the room and have no one know it until it was too late to run. The night of the gala, the island was wrapped in a thick, translucent fog. The estate was lit up like a cathedral, the orange glow of the windows cutting through the gray. As I pulled my modest, late-model SUV into the long, gravel driveway, I saw the line of luxury sedans and sports cars. I saw Julian's brand-new Italian convertible parked right at the front, a trophy he hadn't earned. I sat in the car for a moment, my heart a slow, steady drum. I checked my phone. One final message from my lawyer: the transfer is complete. You are now the primary lien holder. The house is officially yours. They just don't know it yet. I tucked the phone away, adjusted my cuffs, and stepped out into the cold salt air. I wasn't an afterthought anymore. I was the owner. And as I walked toward the heavy oak doors, I saw a familiar figure standing by the window, a glass of scotch in his hand, looking out at the dark, not realizing that the darkness was finally coming inside. The heavy oak doors of the estate didn't just open, they groaned, a sound like a vault giving up its secrets. Stepping into the foyer was like stepping back into a dream I'd spent a decade trying to wake up from. The air was thick with the scent of pine, expensive perfume, and the suffocating musk of old money that was rapidly running out. The Founders' Gala was in full swing, a sea of black ties and silk gowns swirling beneath the crystal chandeliers. To anyone else, it looked like the pinnacle of coastal success. To me, it looked like a funeral for a life I never had. I moved through the crowd like a shark in a koi pond, quiet, unnoticed, and perfectly out of place. No one greeted me at the door. I had to find the coat check myself. When I finally entered the ballroom, I saw them. Silas and Elena were standing near the fireplace, the center of a sycophantic circle, radiating the kind of warmth that only exists when there are witnesses. And there, draped over a velvet armchair like a bored prince, was Julian. He looked exactly as I expected, tanned, teeth whitened to a blinding porcelain, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost as much as my first 3 cars. He was holding court, his voice a low, confident rumble as he talked about synergy and disruption. The favoritism wasn't just visible, it was a physical force. As I approached, I watched Elena reach out and smooth a stray hair on Julian's forehead, her face softening with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. It was a look I had studied from a distance for 20 years, a look I had practiced imagining directed at me, only to realize it was a language I would never speak. When Silas saw me, the change was instantaneous. The light in his eyes didn't just dim, it went out. He didn't smile. He didn't step forward. He just gave a curt, obligatory nod, the kind you give to a waiter who's forgotten your water. "You're late, Leo," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the jovial tone he'd used with the local bank president seconds before. "And you're underdressed." I looked down at my charcoal suit, a garment that cost $15,000 and was hand-stitched in London. Silas, whose eyes only recognized brand logos and flashy price tags, saw it as a generic gray suit from a department store. He saw what he wanted to see, the son who couldn't keep up. "Traffic on the bridge," I said simply. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the internal roar of the room. I was directed, as I always was, to the kids' table in the far corner, a table populated by the college-age children of my parents' associates. At 32, I was the oldest person there by a decade. I sat down, the wooden chair creaking under me, and watched the main table. I watched Julian laugh. I watched Silas pour him a glass of vintage scotch from his private decanter. I watched the hierarchy of breath in action. I was at the edge of the room, near the service door, right where they wanted me. Invisible. An afterthought. But as I picked up my silver fork, I felt the cold weight of the phone in my pocket. I knew what they didn't. That the table I was sitting at, the floor beneath Julian's feet, and the very air Silas was breathing now belonged to the man they had seated next to the kitchen. The gala moved with a practiced, sickening rhythm. Course after course of food that tasted like ash, served by people I used to work alongside at the diner. I sat in my corner, a silent observer of my own exclusion. Across the room, Julian was hitting his stride. He stood up, tapping a crystal flute with a silver spoon, and the room fell into a worshipful silence. He began to speak about his big venture, a luxury yacht-sharing platform that, according to the documents in my briefcase, was nothing more than a glorified pyramid scheme funded by Silas's dwindling retirement accounts. "We aren't just building a company," Julian projected, his arms wide as if to embrace the room. "We're building a legacy. A way for the elite to experience the world without the burden of ownership." The irony was so sharp I nearly choked on my water. Julian, a man who had never owned a single thing he hadn't been given, talking about the burden of ownership. Silas beamed. Elena dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. It was a masterpiece of delusion. Then, the script flipped. My Aunt Margaret, a woman who had always been the family's resident loose cannon, turned toward me. She was 3 martinis in and lacked the practiced cruelty of my parents. She had been the only one I'd stayed in touch with, the only one I'd let slip a few details about my computer stuff months ago. "So, Leo," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet room during a lull in Julian's speech. "How's that company of yours doing? Last I heard, you were closing a pretty massive deal. What was it? Aegis?" The clatter of silverware hitting porcelain was instantaneous. It was the sound of 20 people holding their breath at once. Elena's fork slipped from her fingers, ringing against her plate like a bell. Silas froze, his glass halfway to his mouth. Julian's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He tilted his head, looking at me with the kind of condescending pity you reserve for a child telling a tall tale. "What deal, Leo?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Did you finally get that promotion at the IT desk? We're all so proud of you for sticking with it." I took a slow, deliberate breath. I could feel the heat of the room, the scent of the wood smoke from the fireplace, and the eyes of every person at that table. The vacuum was gone. I stood up, not with a flourish, but with the steady, heavy gravity of a man who no longer had anything to hide. "It wasn't a promotion, Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but in that silent room, it sounded like a crack of thunder. "I sold my company, Aegis Logistics, last quarter." Silas frowned, his brows knitting together in a mask of confusion and burgeoning anger. "Company? What company? You've been working at that diner or whatever it was." "I haven't worked at the diner in 7 years, Silas," I replied, using his first name for the first time in my life. The shift in address hit him like a physical blow. "I've been building a logistics encryption firm. We were acquired by Global Prime. The deal closed for $30 million. The air didn't just leave the room, it vanished." Elena's face twisted into something unrecognizable, a mask of shock that quickly curdled into a sharp, bitter resentment. Julian went pale, then a deep, mottled red, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his champagne flute. It was the heart-hitting peak I had waited for, the moment the mirror was turned on them, and they realized they hadn't just ignored me, they had ignored a fortune. $30 million? Silas stammered, his voice losing its authority, becoming thin and reedy. $30 million, I repeated. Cash. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a battlefield. I watched the gears turning in their heads, the sudden re-evaluation of my worth, the frantic calculation of how this money could save their sinking ship, and beneath it all, the raw, ugly jealousy that I had done it without them. "Leo," Elena said, her voice suddenly high and tight, "why didn't you tell us? Why would you keep such a blessing from your family?" "Because," I said, looking her straight in the eye, "no one ever asked. You were too busy funding Julian's finding himself trips to notice I was building an empire in a basement." The masks finally crumbled. Silas slammed his hand on the table, the plates rattling. "Don't you dare use that tone in this house. We provided for you. We gave you everything. You gave me a lecture on hospital bills while I had a broken arm, Silas, I said, my voice rising for the first time. You gave Julian the silver heirlooms while I ate soup from a can. You didn't provide for me. You tolerated me. And now you're angry because the son you treated like overhead turned out to be the only one with any actual value. The room descended into a chaotic, whispered fervor. Julian stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. He wasn't the prince anymore. He was a cornered animal. You think you're better than us? You think that money makes you special? You only worked so hard because you were trying to compete with me. You owe this family for the inspiration. Inspiration? I laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Julian, you were the warning, not the inspiration. He stepped toward me, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. You're going to give us our share, Leo. It's only fair. Family shares. Mom and Dad are in trouble, and you're sitting on 30 million. You're going to wire 15 million to the family trust by Monday, or you're dead to us. I looked at him, then at Silas, who was nodding in agreement, and finally at Elena, who was looking at me with a terrifying, predatory greed. The golden child was begging, and the parents were demanding. They weren't asking for help, they were demanding a payout for a life they had spent trying to erase. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper, the lien notice. I laid it on the table between the half-eaten lobster and the expensive wine. I'm not giving you 15 million, Julian, I said, my voice dropping back to a whisper. But I think you should all take a very close look at who actually owns the roof over your heads tonight. As Silas reached for the paper, his hands trembling, the lights in the ballroom flickered once, then twice, before plunging the entire estate into a sudden, chilling darkness, and in that blackness, I realized the pings on my server weren't just a memory, they were a countdown that had just hit 0. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a physical weight. For a few heartbeats, the ballroom was a tomb. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, the emergency backup generators kicked in with a low, guttural hum, and the chandelier flickered back to life, casting a sickly, dim amber glow over the wreckage of the dinner table. Julian was still standing, his hand frozen mid-reach for the paper I'd laid down. Silas looked like he'd aged a decade in the dark. But it was Elena's face that stayed with me. The greed in her eyes hadn't vanished in the shadows, it had sharpened into a desperate, feral hunger. Julian finally snatched the paper. He scanned it, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped bird. This is a lien notice, he stammered, his voice jumping an octave. Leo, what the hell is this? Why is your holding company listed as the primary creditor for the estate? Silas grabbed the document from him, his face turning a shade of gray that matched the ash in the fireplace. I watched him read the fine print, the signatures, the debt-buying clauses, the final notices of default. He had been so busy shuffling money to keep Julian's lifestyle afloat that he'd stopped looking at who was buying up his debt on the secondary market. He'd been swimming in shark-infested waters, never realizing I was the one who owned the ocean. You bought our debt? Silas whispered. He looked up, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a parent losing a child, but the fear of a king losing his throne. You've been tracking our finances. You've been planning this. I didn't have to plan much, Silas, I said, leaning back against the cold marble of the mantel. You were hemorrhaging cash. You were taking out high-interest bridge loans to pay for Julian's startup costs and his apartment in the city. You were a walking bankruptcy waiting to happen. I just ensured that when you hit the ground, I was the one holding the deed. Julian's psychological collapse was a sight to behold. He didn't erupt in anger, he dissolved. He sank back into his velvet chair, his hands trembling so hard he spilled the remainder of his scotch onto his silk lapel. You can't do this, he whimpered. This is my house. This is the family legacy. You're the little brother. You're the one who who we took care of. Took care of? I repeated the words, letting them hang in the air like a bad smell. You didn't take care of me. You tolerated my presence while you consumed everything else. And now, you're realizing that the little brother is the only thing standing between you and the street. Julian looked at the guests, the elite he had just been lecturing, who were now whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between the golden child and the ghost. His pride, the only thing he actually owned, was being stripped away in public. He suddenly lunged forward, his face contorted. I deserve a management fee. I've been the face of this family. I've been the one maintaining the brand while you hid in a basement. You owe me 15 million, no, 18 million. For the stress. For the damage you're doing right now. He was begging for a payout to soothe the sting of his own insignificance. He wanted $18 million as a family management fee for a life of being pampered. I looked at my parents, expecting a flicker of shame, a moment of realization. Instead, I saw them nodding. Elena reached out to touch Julian's arm, her eyes fixed on me with a cold, calculating malice. The hierarchy was still intact. Even in the face of theft, even in the face of collapse, they chose him. They always chose him. The American noir of my life reached its peak that night. I walked out of the ballroom, the sound of Julian's sobbing demands echoing off the high ceilings. I didn't feel victorious. I felt like I had finally seen the bottom of the well, and it was even deeper and darker than I'd imagined. But as I reached the heavy oak doors to leave, my phone buzzed with a high-priority alert. My security system hadn't just flagged a ping, it had flagged a breach. Someone hadn't just tried to look at my accounts, they had successfully bypassed the first layer of my personal encryption using a set of security questions that shouldn't have been possible to guess. I sat in my car in the driveway, the engine idling, the fog pressing against the glass. I pulled up the IP logs. The breach was active. It was happening right now. And as I traced the digital fingerprint, my blood turned to ice. The bypass wasn't a hack, it was an entry. Someone had used my childhood social security number, my first pet's name, and the address of the diner. But they had also used a secondary authorization code that was only ever written in one place. A small, locked diary I'd kept in my room when I was 12. A diary I thought I'd lost the year I broke my arm. They weren't just demanding money anymore. They were inside. My parents hadn't just been worried or entitled. While I was standing in the ballroom, Silas and Elena had been using my childhood ghosts to pick the locks on my future. They were attempting to reallocate my wealth before the gala was even over. I realized then that I couldn't just play defense. If I wanted to survive these people, I had to stop being the son they ignored and start being the nightmare they never saw coming. The transition from defense to offense felt like a cold snap in the air. I didn't go back into the house to scream. I didn't call the police, not yet. I drove. I drove through the fog until I reached a nondescript office building in a sleepy part of the island. This was where my lawyer, Claire, kept her secondary files. I let myself in, the silence of the building a bomb after the screeching entitlement of the estate. Claire was already there, illuminated by the glow of 3 monitors. She didn't look surprised to see me. She just turned one of the screens around. They went for the main trust, Leo. They used an old power of attorney form your father had you sign when you were 18, something about university paperwork that you probably didn't read closely. He's trying to claim that as your legal guardian at the time, he has perpetual oversight of your business assets. I felt a surge of nausea. They had planned this. The gala wasn't a celebration, it was a distraction. They invited me back so they could keep me busy while they attempted to lobotomize my bank accounts. How much did they get? I asked. Nothing, Claire said, her voice sharp and clinical. The Aegis protocol flagged the childhood data points as a high-risk redundancy. It locked the accounts the second the power of attorney form was uploaded. But Leo, this is an active attempt at grand larceny. By your own parents. I looked at the documents on her desk. I had been trying to be fair. I had been trying to show them the truth without destroying them. But they had misinterpreted my silence for weakness. They thought they could still treat me like the 9-year-old in the tree, shaming me for the cost of my own survival while they picked my pockets. Serve them, I said. Claire looked up, a faint, dangerous smile touching her lips. All of them. All of them. Silas, Elena, and Julian. I want the cease and desist orders served at the secondary family brunch tomorrow morning. I want the injunctions against their accounts filed by dawn. And Claire. I want the noir play. I want the private investigators to show the dealership invoices for Julian's new car. I want the logs of every wire transfer Silas sent to Julian's lifestyle consultants. I want the world to see exactly how much it costs to keep a golden child shining. The next morning was clear and cold, the kind of day that makes everything look sharp and unforgiving. I didn't go to the brunch, but I watched it through the lens of the PI I'd hired. The video feed showed the patio of a high-end coastal restaurant. Silas and Elena were there, surrounded by a smaller, more intimate circle of relatives, probably spinning a new version of the night's events. Julian was there too, looking hungover but still wearing that mask of unearned confidence. The process servers didn't look like movie characters. They looked like businessmen, sharp suits, briefcases, and a lack of emotion that was more terrifying than anger. They walked up to the table just as the mimosas were being poured. The feed showed Silas taking the envelope, his brow furrowed. Then Elena. Then Julian. I watched the color drain from their faces in real time. I watched the golden child look around the table, realizing his audience was seeing him served with a legal notice of fraud. It wasn't a quiet conversation anymore. It was a public execution of their reputation. The American noir aesthetic I'd cultivated, the cold rain, the sharp lines, the undeniable truth, was finally landing. I sat in my office, watching the chaos unfold on the screen. My phone started ringing. Silas. Then Elena. Then a series of increasingly frantic texts from Julian. I ignored them all. I was busy reviewing the accountability files. But as I scrolled through the dealership invoices the PI had recovered, I found something that made me stop breathing. It wasn't just a car purchase. It was a trade-in. 6 months ago, Julian had traded in a vehicle to help cover the down payment on his Italian convertible. The VIN of the traded vehicle was registered to a car that had been reported stolen 3 years prior. A car that belonged to the woman who ran the diner where I'd worked my graveyard shifts. My parents hadn't just been funding Julian, they had been covering up his crimes. And as I looked at the signature on the forged title transfer, I realized it wasn't Julian's handwriting. It was my father's. The golden child wasn't just a favorite, he was a liability that they were willing to go to prison to protect. I realized then that I hadn't just stumbled into a family feud. I had stumbled into a criminal conspiracy, and the only way out was to burn the whole house down before they could trap me inside. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I'd hoped I'd never need, the one for the lead investigator at the State Financial Crimes Division. I have a file for you, I said, my voice as cold as the morning air. And it starts at the top. The room at the State Financial Crimes Division was smaller than I expected, and it smelled of ozone and stale coffee. I sat across from Investigator Miller, a man with the weary, cynical eyes of someone who had seen exactly how noble families acted when the money ran out. I laid the folder on the table. It was thick, heavy with the weight of 20 years of silence. This isn't just a domestic dispute, Leo, Miller said, flipping through the IP logs and the forged title transfers. You're alleging your father used your identity to shield your brother's criminal activity, and then used that same identity to attempt a breach of your corporate accounts. I'm not alleging it, I said, my voice steady. I'm documenting it. I spent the next 4 hours walking him through the hierarchy of breadth. I showed him the timeline of the bank breaches, the dealership invoices, and the family management fee demands. But the hardest part was the forged car title. My father, Silas. The man who had given me a lecture on the burden of hospital bills, had risked everything to hide Julian's theft. It was the ultimate proof of my insignificance. To save Julian from a mistake, Silas was willing to commit a felony. To save me from a broken arm, he wasn't willing to spend a dime. I need to tell you something, Leo, Miller said, leaning back. Families like yours, they don't go down quietly. They'll try to paint you as the villain. They'll say you're a bitter, greedy son who's attacking his parents for sport. Let them, I said. The truth doesn't need a PR firm. It just needs a subpoena. When I left the station, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. I went back to my minimalist office, the one place where the air felt like it belonged to me. I had set the fire. Now I had to wait and see what it consumed. The fallout was swifter than I imagined. By the following evening, the accountability files had begun to circulate among the family's inner circle. The golden child narrative was disintegrating. My Aunt Margaret called me, her voice trembling. Leo, everyone's talking. Julian's startup partners have pulled out. Silas is being asked to resign from the yacht club board. Elena won't leave the house. Is it true? Did they really try to take your money? They didn't just try to take it, Margaret, I said. They thought it was their right to take it. I hung up, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. I had spent my life being the shadow, the other son. Now, I was the only thing anyone could see. I had become the light that was exposing the rot in the foundation. But then came the counter-move. I should have seen it coming. Late that night, a video was posted to Julian's lifestyle blog. It was a polished, high-definition piece of propaganda. It featured Silas and Elena sitting in their living room, looking frail and heartbroken. They spoke about their troubled younger son, about how they had tried to help me but how I had become consumed by greed. They mentioned my mysterious wealth and hinted that I had earned it through questionable means. They played the victims with a skill that was terrifying to watch. We just want our family back, Elena said into the camera, a single, perfect tear tracking down her cheek. We don't care about the money. We just want Leo to find his way back to the people who love him. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Within hours, the narrative began to shift. The bitter son story started gaining traction. People who hadn't spoken to me in years were suddenly experts on my cold personality. I was the miser sitting on a pile of gold while my elderly parents suffered. The noir play I'd started was being turned against me. I sat in the dark of my office, watching the view count on the video climb. I realized that documentation wasn't enough. In the court of public opinion, a tear is more valuable than a bank log. I had the truth, but they had the story. I looked at the accountability files one more time, searching for the one thing they couldn't spin. And then I saw it, a small, overlooked entry in the dealership's secondary records. When Silas had signed the forged title, he hadn't done it alone. There was a witness signature. A notary. And the name of the notary was someone I'd known my entire life. Someone who had been at the diner every single morning for 20 years. Someone who knew exactly when I worked, exactly what I earned, and exactly how much Silas and Elena had ignored me. I realized then that the big reveal wasn't going to be a document. It was going to be a person. I reached out to my lawyer. Claire, I said, I need you to find a woman named Martha Vance. She used to work the morning shift at the diner. And tell her it's time to tell the story of the boy who worked in the grease while the golden child was being polished. I stood up and looked out at the city, the lights flickering like the code on my screen. The fight wasn't over. It was just moving to the one place my parents couldn't control, the witness stand. And as I prepared the final strategy, I received a text from an unknown number. It was just one sentence, but it made my heart skip a beat. The golden child isn't the only one with secrets, Leo. Check the attic of the boathouse. The text from the unknown number sat on my screen like a live wire. Check the attic of the boathouse. I knew that boathouse. It was a weather-beaten structure at the edge of the property, smelling of creosote and old gasoline, a place Silas had kept locked since I was a teenager. I didn't wait for morning. I drove back to the island, the SUV cutting through a fog so thick it felt like driving through milk. The estate was dark, but the air around it felt charged, as if the house itself was bracing for the impact of what was coming. I bypassed the main gate and walked the shoreline path, the sound of the Puget Sound lapping against the rocks like a persistent, rhythmic warning. The boathouse door was reinforced with a heavy iron padlock, the kind Silas used for things he wanted to forget. I didn't use a key. I used a crowbar. The sound of the wood splintering was the only honest thing I'd heard in that zip code for years. The attic was a cramped, low-ceilinged space filled with the detritus of a life built on facades. There were crates of Julian's old sports trophies, rolls of moth-eaten carpet, and stacks of Founders Gala programs from decades past. But in the far corner, hidden under a heavy canvas tarp, sat a steel filing cabinet. It was labeled LV, Private. Leo Vance. Me. I broke the lock on the top drawer. I expected to find medical records or school reports. Instead, I found a ledger. It was a meticulously kept record in Silas's hand, dating back to the year I turned 10. It wasn't a record of my achievements, it was a record of my cost. Silas had been tracking every cent he'd ever spent on me, every gallon of milk, every pair of shoes, every kilowatt of electricity my bedside lamp had consumed. But next to those numbers was another column. Insurance recovery. My blood turned to ice as I realized what I was looking at. When I'd broken my arm at age 9, Silas hadn't just lectured me on the cost, he had filed a massive personal liability claim against the neighbor whose tree I'd climbed. He had collected $20,000 in a settlement. He'd told me we were struggling while he pocketed the equivalent of 2 years of my diner wages. And it didn't stop there. There were life insurance policies taken out on me. High-premium plans with accidental death riders, all while Julian was being funded with the proceeds of my supposed accidents. I wasn't just the other son. I was a hedge. I was a financial instrument Silas and Elena used to subsidize the golden child. They hadn't just ignored me, they had been betting on my failure, and occasionally, my demise, to keep Julian in silk ties and Italian leather. I sat on the dusty floor of the boathouse, the ledger in my lap, feeling the final tether to my family snap. The American noir of my life had just shifted from a story of neglect to a story of predatory intent. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a man who has seen the monster's face and realized it's wearing his father's eyes. The deposition room felt like a pressurized chamber. The air was dry, the lighting was clinical, and the silence was absolute. Silas and Elena sat across from me, flanked by their high-priced lawyers, men who looked like they were beginning to realize their retainers weren't high enough for the storm that was about to hit. Julian was there too, looking small and fragile, his golden child glow replaced by the gray pallor of a man who has realized the world doesn't owe him a living. My lawyer, Claire, didn't start with the bank breaches or the forged titles. She started with Martha Vance. Martha sat at the end of the table, her hands folded over her handbag. She looked at Silas with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Under oath, Martha described 20 years of watching a boy work until his hands bled while his parents sat in the diner's corner booth, laughing about their latest vacation. She described the day Silas had come in, bragging about a windfall he'd received after Leo's little mishap with his arm, while I was in the back mucking out the grease traps to pay for my own school supplies. He was a shadow to them, Martha said, her voice cracking the clinical silence of the room. But to us, he was the only one in that family worth a damn. They treated him like a stray dog while they fed the other one steak off a silver platter. Then Claire laid the boathouse ledger on the table. The cost of Leo was entered into the record. The room grew so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I watched Silas's face. The mask of the grieving parent didn't just slip, it disintegrated. He looked at the ledger, then at me, and for the first time in 32 years, he didn't look at me with condescension. He looked at me with the terror of a man seeing his executioner. "You took out policies on me, Silas?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You turned my broken bones into Julian's tuition? You were betting on me not making it to 21. Elena tried to speak, her voice a shrill, desperate thing. "It was for the family, Leo. We were trying to ensure everyone was provided for. You were so resilient. You didn't need the help Julian did." "Resilient?" I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "I wasn't resilient. I was surviving you. You didn't give me a roof. You gave me a cage and charged me rent in blood." The deposition turned into a rout. The American noir aesthetic I'd cultivated, the documentation, the witnesses, the undeniable truth, collapsed their defense like a house of cards in a hurricane. By the time the noon recess hit, their lawyers were huddled in the hallway, whispering about limited liability and plea deals. They knew the golden child was a lead weight, and I was the one holding the chain. The final settlement wasn't a negotiation, it was a surrender. I sat in Claire's office as the documents were signed. Silas and Elena agreed to a total restitution, every cent they had attempted to steal, plus the interest on the insurance recovery funds they had embezzled from my childhood. They signed a notarized statement admitting to the identity theft and the forged titles. And most importantly, they signed the no-contact order. A legal barrier that made them dead to me in the eyes of the law. Julian lost everything. The Italian convertible was repossessed. The city loft was vacated. The lifestyle blog vanished into the digital ether. He was left with nothing but the name Vance, a name that was now synonymous with fraud and entitlement in every circle he had ever craved. He stood in the hallway of the courthouse after the final signing, looking at me with a look that was part hatred and part begging. "What am I supposed to do, Leo?" he asked, his voice a pathetic, thin sound. "I don't have anything. I don't know how to be someone like you." "That's the point, Julian," I said, adjusting my charcoal cuffs. "You never had to be anyone. You were just a reflection of their vanity. Now, the lights are off. Good luck finding yourself in the dark." I walked out of the courthouse and into the cold, clear afternoon. I drove back to the island, but I didn't go to the estate. I went to the cliffs overlooking the sound. I stood at the edge, the salt air filling my lungs, feeling the hierarchy of breath finally dissolve. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I wasn't the other son. I was just Leo. I pulled my phone from my pocket and deleted the final accountability file. The fire had finished its work. The estate was being sold to a local nonprofit. A center for underprivileged youth, a place where kids who worked graveyard shifts could find a ladder that wasn't missing any rungs. Silas and Elena were moving to a small, unremarkable apartment in the city, living on a fixed income and the bitter taste of their own signatures. I looked out at the water, watching a distant freighter move toward the horizon. I thought about the boy in the tree. I thought about the boy in the grease traps. I thought about the man who had bought his own heir. I realized then that the big reveal wasn't about the money or the house or the revenge. It was about the fact that I didn't need them to see me to exist. I had built a life out of the shadows they had cast, and that life was brighter than anything they had ever dreamed for their golden child. As I turned to walk back to my car, I felt a strange, light sensation in my chest. For 32 years, I had been carrying the weight of their expectations and their neglect. Now, the weight was gone. I was free. I was successful. And most importantly, I was whole. I looked back at the island one last time, at the place where the Vance legacy had burned to ash. The invisible sun was finally the only one left standing in the light. They wanted my future, but they didn't realize it was never theirs to take. It belonged to the boy who didn't cry when his arm broke. It belonged to the man who built a shield in a basement. It belonged to me. And as I drove away, the fog finally lifted, revealing a horizon that was wide, open, and entirely, beautifully mine. I was no longer a character in their story. I was the author of my own, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't wait to see what happened on the next page.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.